Now we welcome Reverend Paul Johnson, who will be speaking to us on plotting resurrection.
Very good. A number of years ago, I was much taken by a piece I read by the late E.B. White in reference to his wife, Catherine. It regarded something he observed shortly before her death from cancer. She was in the latter stages of that disease, and he saw her one dark October day in their garden with a diagram in front of her as she plotted out where all of the bulbs would be buried, both the old and the new ones. He said, there she was, bedraggled, ill though she was, plotting the resurrection. Isn't that interesting and captivating? These words have stuck with me over the years, and I've been moved by her courage, by her response to hope for a future that she likely would not enjoy herself, but others would enjoy. And I was taken with a juxtaposition of the two words, plotting and resurrection, because in some ways they don't really seem to go together, do they? Plotting means planning or scheming or deep consideration. Of course, resurrection usually refers to something exogenous to human will. In Orthodox theology, of course, it was something that happened to Jesus as his body was resuscitated by divine power. But of course, then there's the more metaphorical meaning of the term resurrection, a revivifying, a revival of someone who has been in the slough of despond after experiencing loss, but then has been brought back to life again, back to life, back to enthusiasm. And of course, that word enthusiasm actually means, in its root, divine inspiration. So something from outside is the meaning of resurrection. But in my experience, as I think of it, these two words do have a relationship. Resurrection to new life does not only come from without, but it also comes from within, in part at least through human will, through human plotting and human planning. I think of the case of Jesus' disciples who mourned and grieved his death, but somehow, through exercise of their will, they had a dramatic impact upon the world in response to Jesus' teachings. And I have thought of this in terms of even of Jesus' parables. Remember perhaps one of the best-known parables of the prodigal son, that son who took his inheritance and went out to a far country and lived riotously until all of his financial resources were expended, and he's really brought down to the lowest level possible for a young Jewish man, feeding pigs. And he was so hungry, he was tempted to eat the slop that he was feeding the pigs. And then he began to plot and scheme. He said to himself, even the servants in my father's house are faring better than I am, and how about if I go back and own up to my wrongs and ask to be taken back as a servant? And so he goes back. Of course, he's accepted by his father. And his father says to the jealous elder son at the party that was being given to the prodigal, it is appropriate that we celebrate, for your brother who was dead is now alive again, due in part to that younger son's plotting and planning. Or I think of my favorite hero from the Nazi period, Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist who was imprisoned in a Nazi death camp. He wrote in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that the one thing that kept him going was planning that after the war, he envisioned himself in a well-heated and well-lighted room before a group of people lecturing about the psychological aspects of the Nazi death camps. That vision kept him going. That plotting kept him going for all those years until, indeed, he not only lectured about that theme, but he wrote a book about it as well. Okay. So, all in all, he made a choice for life as opposed to giving up to death. And I see that plotting for resurrection by two folks I deeply admire as well, Jimmy and Rosalind Carter. After their devastating loss to Ronald Reagan in 1980, they went back to Plains, tail between their legs, in great sorrow for their loss. They were very dejected, and they found that their business as peanut farmers had been mismanaged, and they were over $1 million in debt. And so what were they going to do? Well, they put their shoulder to the wheel, and they resurrected their business. But they often talked with each other about what are we going to do with the rest of our lives as they walked in the forests and the fields. And Rosalind writes that one night she woke up in the middle of the night, and there was Jimmy sitting upright in bed. And usually he slept through the whole night. And she said to him, "Well, what's up, Jimmy?" And he said, "I've got it. I know what we can do at our library. We can establish a center for the mediation of international conflict. No one else can do it exactly the way that we can do it." And, of course, they went on to do that, not only for mediating conflict, but for, supervising elections, monitoring elections, and eliminating river blindness in many parts of the world. They plotted their resurrection. One of my favorite movies has to be The Shawshank Redemption. How many of you have seen that? Isn't that a great movie? But remember Andy, the main character? He's unjustly accused and tried and convicted for a murder that he didn't commit. He is serving a life sentence in a Maine prison. But he enters prison dejected, depressed, but he exercises his human will in terms of thinking of possibilities. He gets involved in the prison library as his project and realizes that they need more resources. And so every week he sends a letter to the state legislature asking for more funds. And the warden poo-poos that idea. You're not going to get anything. Well, he gets a pittance. But then, the second year, he sends 2 letters every week. And to the surprise of everyone, they're given adequate funding, and he creates an oasis within that prison. He becomes invaluable to the people in the prison, not only as administrator, but as a tax consultant. And behind the scenes, he's working out his eventual escape. But while plotting his resurrection, he's able to enjoy music and art, the affection of his friend Red, and he's able to surmount the beatings and the sexual assault he was subject to when he first entered the prison. But plotting as a resurrection of spirit and purpose, that was Andy. That was Andy. And, after seeing that movie, I think 3 times, I can hardly believe that it's not a true event. It's so true to life, isn't it? But ministers often see this among their parishioners who have been brought low by loss of a job, loss of career, loss of family members through death or divorce, loss of a part of one's body, loss of religious faith. I could go on and on, all the losses that we're subject to. But I've been a witness to people's resurrection so often. So often it's plotted. And we know a lot about grieving. It's been studied extensively. We know it's not a piece of cake. And maybe rather than plotting, I should say. It's plotting and grief, one step after another. But we know it may involve shock and denial to begin with. We know that it involves sadness and perhaps depression. We know that it sometimes involves anger and guilt. It may involve physical relief through crying or through other means. But it's a difficult process. It's no piece of cake, this grieving. But so often, people who give themselves to the process come to eventual acceptance and newness of life. It's been amazing to see this over the years. And I'm much taken by a story told by one of my ministerial colleagues, Reverend Roger Fritz. For many years, he was in my neck of the woods when I was up in Maryland at Bethesda. But for many years then, he was minister of our church in Sarasota before retiring about 2 years ago. But he tells a story of a member of his New Bedford congregation by the name of John. He was a faithful usher in the church for several years, week after week after week. He was a graduate of Harvard and MIT with degrees in architecture and city planning. And he used his knowledge in revamping an old Victorian house in New Bedford. He put a lot of resources into it. He had it redone, and then he had it placed on the market. But then, leaking gas within the house caused an explosion which destroyed the whole building. Well, he went back to the drawing boards, and he thought he would start on his own house, which was Victorian in style. And so he took down the TV antenna, which was unsightly, but had been used by the previous owner as a lightning rod. Lightning struck that house and burned it to the ground. And shortly after that, he and his wife divorced. My goodness. But John kept coming to church. He still was able to draw on emotional resources, and he decided to start a business, an old-fashioned ice cream parlor in New Bedford. Only thing is, it was in a crime-ridden area close to the harbor, and the harbor was polluted, and that kept people away. It just wasn't the best place for an old-fashioned ice cream parlor. The business went bust. But he had an idea. He found out that the EPA would give that community $20 million to clean up their harbor if they would just add a nominal fee to their sewer tax, which was part of their water bills. So he thought this was wonderful news, and he decided to run as mayor with this as his principal platform. Well, his opponent countered with that old saw, no new taxes. No new taxes. John is going to raise your taxes. Besides that, he's a homosexual, which was not true. And he said he's a Unitarian, of course, which was true. And he lost by a wide margin. Oh, my goodness, this guy had one unhappy instance after another. And after that loss and all of the vindictiveness of the electoral process, he was as low as he ever was. But then the next summer, the city had to close the beaches because of the pollution in the harbor. The mayor blamed it on a passing cruise ship, but a tough investigation showed that it was due to the sewage that came from the treatment plant. He said, this is my chance. He ran again and won. And for several years, he was at the top of his game, resurrected in the position of mayor, doing what needed to be done and cleaning up that bay. So I stand in awe of the human spirit, what can be done through plotting and planning. I see it in my own life. In the spring of 1967, I was at an evangelical Christian seminary and realized that I no longer believed in the core beliefs of that seminary and that denomination. and that I had to leave. My whole life trajectory was at stake. What was I to do? Well, I made the decision to leave that seminary, and I think I made the final decision in the parking lot of the Unitarian Universalist Church that was located across the street from my seminary. Well, 7 years later, I was participating in that congregation, that Unitarian Universalist congregation, as the intern minister in my preparation for Unitarian Universalist ministry. I had found my niche, but oh, the plotting and the planning that had led to that moment. The questioning, the reading, the interviewing, plotting my resurrection. So if you're here this morning and you're on top of the world and things are going well and you have surmounted any losses you've experienced and your future looks bright, thank the graciousness of existence that you're at that point. But if you're here in the midst of loss, hang on, plot, plan, establish alliances. Now, is it only human will that is operative in this process of resurrection? Well, many ideas about that exist, don't they? Some say it's God as a transcendent power within us and beyond us. Some would say, such as the humanist psychologist Abraham Maslow, that it's the inward pull towards self-actualization. The great noted philosopher Alfred North Whitehead had claimed that it's the lure of the divine to greater harmony and beauty within our lives. But whatever you call it, let's celebrate it this day, this Easter Sunday. Let's celebrate plotting of the resurrection. And I close with a wonderful statement by Frederick Marryat, who was president of the American Unitarian Association from 1931 until his death in 1958. I just love what he had to say. He said, "When I go to church on Easter Sunday, I expect to be reminded of the elemental truth that in this universe of ours, with all its hesitancies and timidities and tragedies, and tragedies, the tides of life are flowing fresh, manifold, and free. And I expect to find myself swept up into participation in the universal chant of praise for the irresistible shining glory of the great gift of life, which for a brief moment and in an infinitesimal degree I have the privilege of sharing." So, keep plotting. Keep resurrecting. Happy Easter. So may it be.